Okay. Okay, we've got quite a big crowd joining us online from all over the world, including India, which is now at 10:30 in the evening. So some dedicated, some real Piers devotees. Welcome everyone to our annual MN Srinivas Lecture, which has been running at the King's India Institute for I think at least 8 years now. It's being supported by the India Institute, by the Royal Anthropological Institute, and also by a project on Indian politics in its vernaculars, of which Piers is a part, which is funded by the European Research Council. So I can't think of another living anthropologist, certainly not in Britain, better suited to give a lecture dedicated to the memory of Mysore Narasimha Srinivas, known as MN Srinivas to his friends and family. This lecture series is a commemoration of an exemplary anthropological life which MN Srinivas lived, the kind that Piers Vitebsky too has lived and is still living. His life has been exemplary for its intellectual autonomy, for its courage and social irreverence. A life fueled by curiosity and a taste for adventure, all increasingly scarce virtues in the humanities and social sciences today. Piers started his education at one of Britain's most prestigious and competitive grammar schools, where he was a star student of Greek and Latin, went there on scholarship. He went on to Cambridge to study classics, ancient Greek, a subject with unrivaled prestige in Oxford, in case anyone's unaware. He could have certainly become a superb classicist and would have lived a comfortable life full of high-table dinners and accolades. But he never gave a damn about any of that. Instead, Piers traveled to Greece, where he learned modern Greek. Then he traveled to Iran, where he learned Farsi. And en route, he realized that the world of the living was even more exciting and interesting than the world of the dead that he so loved in Greece and Rome. So he caught the ethnographer's bug, the yearning to learn about a very different way of life, and became an anthropologist, who ended up in tribal Eastern India among the Sora, with whom he lived for years, learned their language, ran across mountains for years barefoot, acquired a glamorous menu of exotic diseases, and wrote a book, Dialogues with the Dead, where he described a world where the dead, whom he abandoned earlier in his career, were just as alive as the living, and intruded constantly and impertinently into the living world. He described what he understood about that world with no regard for fashionable theories, which then, as today, were the conveyors of primitive career accumulation in anthropology. For him, career was never a focus. Learning was. And anthropology offered by far the best, the most interesting, the most precise way to learn about the human world. So Piers spent another several years in a completely different part of the world, in Siberia, producing a terrific book about reindeer herders, known as the reindeer people, but again, with no nods to antler theory. His intellectual freedom, his commitment to truth, which is to say, a courage to say what one sees, not the slavish addition to whatever things are expected to be said at a given moment, has meant that his books have probably been read by more people outside anthropology than inside it. It has also probably meant that they've been read by a lot more people who wanted to read them, as opposed to who had to read them. Piers's books, which read like exquisite novels, have been read by hundreds of thousands of people the world over. People give them as Christmas gifts, have his books on their table, on their bedsides, and read them out loud to children and lovers at night. He produced several other books and documentary films, but all along he continued to return to his first and greatest ethnographic love, Soraland, which in the meantime changed beyond recognition in ways that Piers has found both intellectually disorienting and morally disconcerting, ways that deeply challenged how he imagined and what he loved about the Sora world. And it is out of the courage to face this deeply personal challenge that his most recent and profoundly moving book, Living Without the Dead, has been born. Please welcome Piers Vitebsky, who will tell you all about the Sora and their brave new world, and no doubt also about Matthew.
Well, thank you very much for that Thank you for inviting me and also for turning up here. Can you hear me? Do I need to use this?
We can hear you, but that's nice.
Or can I just talk like this?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, MN Srinivas is remembered for his many contributions, including his classic monograph on the chords, and for introducing the term Sanskritization. He's also remembered for overcoming a disaster which strikes at the very heart of anthropology. His fieldnotes were largely destroyed in a fire. Few of us would like to echo this line in the dedication to his book, The Remembered Village. Quote, "Had not all the copies of my processed notes been burnt, I would not have thought of writing a book based entirely on my memory of my field experience. I wish, therefore, to acknowledge the part played by the arsonists in the birth of this book." But what happens if an anthropologist's field notes survive? This is my fortunate situation, stretching back 49 years to my first arrival in 1975 among the Sora, an Adivasi community in southern Odisha, or in the colonial terminology which still persists today, a tribal people. In the 1970s, Xeroxing was unavailable, and I hugged my field notes to my knees on the flight home, having already lost a bag of cassettes of unrepeatable rituals at a bus stand in Madras, probably overlaid with Tamil film music before being sold on the TV. But the majority of my notes and recordings survive, now reinforced by frequent revisits and digital possibilities of depositing multiple copies all over the place. This huge archive of oral texts, recordings, photos, and life stories now brings its own possibilities and responsibilities. Initially, these were for my own research purposes, but they're now acquiring an unforeseen role for young Sora themselves, as some of them become eager to know about a way of life they have never experienced firsthand, and which in itself left no written traces or photos or audio recordings or genealogies. That is, they lack the very stuff that anthropologists gather. This curiosity has arisen after passing through a period of rejecting all memory of the world of their parents. In the 1970s, I studied the shamanic culture that still prevailed in the mountainous Sora heartland. But since then, younger generations have converted to a range of Christian and Hindu sects, but mostly Baptist, expanding a legacy left by earlier Canadian missionaries. They now go to school, but this literacy tells them nothing of the old culture of their grandparents. What avenues do they have to know about that culture? Well, there are the last of the old timers who are dying out fast with their family stories. But these are increasingly drowned out by the narrative of the Baptist Church, often in the person of their own children, which proclaims that the old timers literally walked in darkness and worshipped devils. Other early visitors, even anthropologists, also thought Sora religion was oppressive. And then there are my field notes. These are mostly in Sora, a Munda language of the Austroasiatic family, while young people's schooling is in the dominant Oriya language of Odisha. So I just want to show you, if I can make it work. Good. We're going to press this. Press that. Oh. Wrong keyboard, sorry. Oh, there you are. Fields. And the next one. Oh, so you're using that. Yeah, okay. So, ancient Indian cassette tapes. In the 1970s, religion in this Sora heartland revolved around a unique form of dialogues between the living and the dead. And the dead spoke through the mouths of shamans. Almost every day, in every village, these shamans, usually female, would enter trance, leaving their body vacant for their clients' dead relatives to talk through their mouth. So I call this religion animist, to distinguish it from other Hindu as well as Christian. So the old lady in the center is a shaman in trance, and the woman embracing her is a mourner, is speaking to the dead person who is speaking through the shaman's mouth. What was there to talk about? All illnesses were caused by dead people. This was not just a medical matter, but one of relationships. The occasions for staging a trance were at a funeral or to cure a sick person. Each time you fell ill, it was a reminder of your attachment to a dead person who had started to eat your soul, thereby repeating his own symptoms in you. And for simplicity, I'll use she for shamanism. The cure consisted in offering him the blood of a sacrificial animal as a substitute for your own soul, and persuading him through love to leave you alone. If this worked, you recovered. If not, you died from a repetition of his illness. Once you were dead, you would join him in the form of death, which corresponded to the symptoms you now both shared, and start attacking others in turn. Thus, people who died of smallpox resided in a local smallpox site. People who died with swelling went and resided in a certain water spring, and so on. So I'd like to show you a video of two shamans sitting side by side, a man and a woman. Various dead people are speaking one after another through them, and various other living people are clinging onto them, embracing them, speaking and lamenting. I asked for a short clip, but unfortunately it's more than a minute, but I don't know how to cut it. So here it goes. Next to them is the other. We're coming to this bit. So, in dialogues, the living and the dead construct a shared narrative, and this narrative is developed and modified through a sequence of funeral rites, plus numerous rituals of divination and healing, as the dead person continues to come and talk. At first, the dead person is trapped in the form of his death, and over several years, the living mourners persuade him to shift from being an aggressive agent of death to becoming a protective ancestor. There's close correlation between emotional distress in the mourner and the dead person's tendency to attack. Through a mutual negotiation and a parallel evolution, the dead person's aggression and the mourner's grief are transformed together. The ancestors are said to redeem the dead person. So let me give you an example. This is the dialogue in front of you. Pandari is dead, and she is coming back, and I'll explain the case. Sagala was a landless youth who had made a love marriage with Pandari, very much against the wishes of her prosperous lineage. By May 1979, they had a one-year-old baby boy called Disam. One day, Pandari returned home from a visit to her brother's village, carrying the baby and feeling unwell. She died that night. The next morning, as usual, there was an inquest. A shaman called up the dead woman so that everyone could interrogate her about how she died. A stream of other spirits also came, one after another, to join the discussion. The dead woman explained herself what had happened to her. She had been killed by a gang of ancestors from her own brother's lineage. She was not the main target, she was just collateral damage. The real target of the attack was the baby boy she was killing. Pandari had bent over the baby to shield him, and in their onslaught, the spirits killed her instead. So I won't read this out, I'll give you a moment to look at it. What you notice is that Pandari again and again insists on her loyalty to her husband's lineage, as opposed to that of her brothers. The child's existence confirmed the validity of her marriage in defiance of her brother's opposition. Moreover, if her brothers later died without a male heir, this boy could make a plausible claim on their fields. So Pandari's brothers had already raided the house and snatched back her personal belongings, which was a cruel gesture implying that the baby would not survive to inherit them. They also took home a portion of her ashes and of her soul, as is usual for marriage, to incorporate her into their own ancestors too. The brothers went on to stage a rivalry and hoped that this would yield a conflicting verdict. However, spirits do not always say what we want them to say. Even in the setting of her brother's house, and speaking through a shaman from their own village, the dead woman confirmed her original story, and the ancestors responsible came and confessed to the killing. To her brother's fury, the dead Pandari also advised her young sister to marry Sagala instead, which is a common pattern for a second, and bring up the baby. But meanwhile, he seemed unlikely to survive anyway, since the Sora had no tradition of wet nursing and did not milk cattle. I helped to get the baby to a distant Catholic nun's orphanage. He did survive on town road, and Pandari's younger sister did indeed marry Sagala. So when a person died, sometimes the verdict would be simple. When an old person died, they would simply be taken perhaps to join their dead parents or spouse. But the death of a young person required more explanation, and this explanation could be sociologically opportunistic. In Pandari's case, there was already an active conflict, and her death provided an occasion to develop it and argue it through. Srinivas wrote that disputes in Rampura, quote, reveal motivations and relationships with the clarity with which lightning illuminates the surroundings on a dark night. But the quarrels in his Karnataka village were never expressed in this distinctive Sora idiom. I still remember the emotions I felt at that time, but many of the details remain only because I wrote them down, and later transcribed the tape-recorded dialogue, edited it, and studied it over and over again. How did this system work, a system of remembering, for them, without writing, tape recording, or photography? The dead had no visual image, but their memories persisted performatively as a voice, and, unlike a photo, they evolved. Dialogues with the dead were religion, genealogy, and probate law, but they were also bereavement therapy, of a special sort. The living and the dead are both being healed together in a parallel process. For a psychotherapist's patient, memories of the dead exist only in the patient's own mind. But for these Sora, they roamed at large outside the mind of any remember, and had their own agency and initiative. A Sora person was largely composed of their relations with other dead people. These memories literally speak. So in dialoguing with the dead, you're actually arguing with your own memories of that person. The ultimate point of dialogues with the dead was to give structure and pace to the process of forgetting. Over several years, the dead person gradually stopped causing illness, until a point when they gave their name to a new baby among their descendants. For an elderly patriarch, this might take generations, but a young person might do it quite quickly. Pandari's sister went on to have a baby girl, and I already knew enough to predict, correctly, that the dead Pandari would turn up in another dialogue to give the baby her own name. Many years later, a dead person would die a second death in the underworld and turn into a butterfly. I compared this with my written genealogies and realized that the time when someone died again in the underworld corresponded to the time when there was nobody left alive who remembered them in person. Butterflies have no voice, no story, no relationships. They're beyond the reach of any dialogue because there's nothing left to discuss. They're memories without remembrance. What did other techniques of memory, such as writing and record keeping, mean for my Sora friends? People became used to my pen and notebook and would hold my microphone on my wrist all the time. There at the top, you see someone holding a microphone and a notebook behind it. They would wake me at night to watch a divination and walk me to events in other villages to keep me busy. As one of my drinking companions joked, You should marry that shaman, it's a perfect match. She'll go into trance and you'll write it all down. But the main meaning of religion in the lives was as a tool of power and oppression in the hands of outside traders and officials. In colonial and pre-colonial times, the Sora lived at the jungly margins of remote kingdoms and were exploited by the local agents of those distant Rajas in a regime of extreme resource extraction, poverty, and humiliation. Sources from the colonial period reveal a relentless striving to squeeze revenue out of an undeveloped area in a competition between local Rajas and the more distant British administration. Chronic indebtedness at all levels, feudal henchmen with grandiose titles, in effect licensed bandits, freelance traders and moneylenders, even without such titles, and a resigned recognition that administrative control was possible only by relying on these go-betweens, even though it was the harshness of their extortions that caused unrest in the first place. In the 1970s, when I got there, this Sora heartland was still illiterate and monolingual, and the lingering persistence of this feudal system was closely linked to their ignorance of Oriya, the regional language of Odisha. Don Morpano traders had a monopoly on selling sacrificial buffaloes at very high prices, and also on translation between the Sora and Oriya-speaking officials, in a toxic nexus with police and forestry officers, and indigenous Sora village headmen as their compromised collaborators. The headman's lineages hoarded paddy fields in the valleys, while poor Reuters subsisted on shifting cultivation on the slopes. For Sora, the power of state agents had a distinctive political property. You could never participate in it as a subject or agent, but only as its object or victim. You could only endure it, or outwit it, or evade it. Here there was no dialogue or negotiation, and its sullen acceptance rested on the threat of violence without redress. In this setting, female shamans gained their ability to trance by marrying male spirits in the underworld. These spirits were not Sora, but high-class spirits, kshatriya, rajas, policemen, and clerks. That is, the same categories who oppressed the Sora above them. They spoke in Sora, but they were actually Oriya. They wielded the weapon of literacy and would compel Sora ancestors to come to dialogues by writing their names in the logbooks of underworld police stations. The Sora relation to their ancestors was partially defensive, but it was based on intimate kinship. The state and its Hindu castes were alien and dangerous. When a shaman married a helper spirit in the underworld, she was, in effect, marrying the state in order to domesticate it. Srinivas defines Sanskritization as the taking over of the customs, rites, and beliefs of the Brahmins. True, Sora shamans did adopt some Brahmin-like taboos about beef and menstruation, which did not concern other Sora to satisfy their spirit husbands. But the main point of these spirits was their kshatriya-like clerical and coercive power. Srinivas later acknowledged the idea of kshatriyization. And in tribal areas, these values were promoted by zamindars to consolidate their own power. And this is what we see here, I think, in Sora. Literacy reached these villages first from the Baptist Church, in their own language and using the Roman alphabet, before the state caught up with schools, mainly during Rajiv Gandhi's development thrust in the 1980s. Schooling has made all young Sora literate in Oriya, and now gradually also in English, as they aim for road-building contracts or government jobs, as teacher, tahsildar, even as policeman. Though there is a new problem as residential schools downgrade the Sora language and lead Sora to forget it or be ashamed of it. Perhaps it's less important to disentangle Brahmanical from Kshatriya values than to consider the range of cosmologies within which young people can now pursue their new aspirations, and to understand what this range itself is telling us. The old Sora did have gods who created the world at the beginning of time, but these gods then withdrew, leaving action and agency in the world to spirits alone. So the animist cosmology was essentially a religion without gods. All new Sora religious forms place active gods at the center of their cosmology. I'll briefly review the most important ones. Firstly, Christianity. The Canadian Baptist missionaries were thrown out in the 1970s when I was first there, but they had planted a seed which then flourished. By the 1990s, most young people had become Christian, with the original Baptists now facing competition from Catholics and Seventh-day Adventists and all sorts of sects. The large hollow church buildings offered the first ever large indoor spaces and also functioned as youth clubs. Today, the next generation who were born into Christianity know no other life and have never lived the animist spirituality of sects. Christianity has combined with later schooling to sweep away an oppressive and humiliating feudal local regime. Illness and death are now thought to be caused by germs, to be warded off by a combination of hospital medicine and Christian prayer. The dead no longer cause events among the living, and the living have no role in managing the ongoing state of the dead. In the old Sora world, death was a state of separation in which the dead kept bringing themselves to the attention of the living. They craved acknowledgement, and their need to talk was matched by an equal need in their children. Dialogues with the dead are forbidden by the church because they reinforce attachment between the living and the dead, and distract people's religious energy from God and Jesus. So the parents of young children, young Christians, became afraid to die because they anticipated reaching out from the underworld for dialogue, but getting no response. This also created a very different kind of person. Christians have adapted the old term redemption, but changed the idea of what we are redeemed from. Animist ancestors used to redeem us from death as the price of human attachment. But Jesus redeems us from the new idea of sin in a new dualistic cosmology, which places all the old spirits on the side of Satan. The Baptist soul reflects this duality. The old animist soul had no internal conflicts, and these all took place in the interpersonal space of relationships with others. The Baptist has a more complex internal soul, locating emotion inside the heart and liver rather than in the interactions between persons, and making these the seat of a moral person. And this judgment is not only from the people around you and your ancestors as previously, but now also from God. I'm just going to show you a bit of a sermon from the church.
Scroll across, and then come on. No.
Oh, yes.
Binalen ogan di TV, itirasan dakan ne kanan singlian, itirasan dakan ne belimbi mendaku, tine karanjiran jenang deti, kitung nyenap seri dirembari daku. Bino ada kitungan, nyenap seri dengan. Itin lumna nyenap mang, do terang di lagi itin lumlai, nami itin daku, ada kitung ni jauh dari. Karena sana ni.
You notice where the old timers were all in.
Karena sana tadi yang dong bujang janji,
There's no
dia
body
bangkong le
contact.
kerembari jenang daku. Kaniasan,
The
dirga le jubara le plan, itin.
High up on the platform behind the table. While villages in the Sora mountain heartland have turned totally to baptism and other Christian churches, other Sora downhill towards the plains are being drawn into neo-Hindu movements. Here the idea is that tribes like the Sora are not spiritually or culturally distinct, but are Hindus who lost contact and got cut off in the jungle. They're not Aboriginal Adivasi, but forest dwellers, Vanvasi, occupying a specialized ecological niche. The promotion of orthodox Hindu values among tribals is presented not as conversion, but as showing them their true nature as Hindus in order to bring them back into the fold. Now, becoming a neo-Hindu like this is not like the Baptist shock of repudiation, and it doesn't bring the same pressure to abandon your parents. A modernist social and political agenda is presented as a restoration of a purer ancient time. The Sora should be retrieved from their jungly state and led to a higher cultural level. In addition, a customized local variant has developed. Oriya Brahmins have long said that their god Jagannath was originally a deity of the jungle Sora. A Brahmin called Vidyapati seduced the Sora priest's daughter, stole the god, and installed him in a huge temple in Puri, where he is now considered an avatar of Vishnu and the most important god in the whole of Odisha. In the 1970s, the Sora in my area showed no interest in this story. But by the 1990s, they were starting agitations against the Brahmins who had stolen the god. At the same time as local Hindu activists were starting to claim that some key episodes in the Ramayana happened right here in Sora. Rama's jungle exile took place here, and it was the Sora who taught him to use bows, arrows, and axes. In one key episode of the Ramayana, a woman in the jungle gives the god Rama a mango to eat. Her name was Sabari. Aha, of course, this means she was Sabara, which is another way of pronouncing the word Sora. So this draws the Sora further into a national mythology by localizing this mythology in their territory through narratives of their own participation. While Christianity promotes rupture from a bad pagan past, neo-Hindu cults are based on a return to a good mythic past. Hindu forms keep some strands of the old religion, but bring them into line with national orthodoxy, especially by eliminating blood sacrifice, which was the foundation of the logic of the old religion. There's also another neo-Hindu movement called the pure or clear-sighted, whom I would call alphabet worshippers. In 1936, a Sora received a dream showing him where to find a special Sora script magically inscribed on a mountaintop. This was a syllabic Indic script, but was indecipherable to readers of other nearby scripts such as Oriya and Telugu. Each letter was a transformation of a spirit whose name began with that syllable. The old spirits had literally turned into letters of this alphabet, and that's what they kept singing. People thought he was crazy, but, quote, his standard of thinking was so high that he remained without food on that mountain for 21 days. The founder was buried squatting upright like a coconut so that he would re-sprout. A bamboo tube stuck out of the grave to carry the script around the land in the fumes from the decomposition of his brain. The Sora alphabet worshippers developed the Juggernaut story further. After the god transferred his favors from the ancient Sora to the Brahmins, the Sora sank back into a primitive ritual style based on blood and liquor. And this, of course, is actually the Sora religion that I studied in the 1970s. They also take the fetishization of literacy beyond the shaman's underworld clerks and policemen. That dream in 1936 marked the return of the god to the Sora, but in the new form of Akshara Brahma, which I'm told means both imperishable Brahma and alphabet Brahma. Significantly, the devotees of the cult are hardly able to read a sentence in this script. The letters are not there for communication, but to be worshipped in themselves. There's a close echo here of the old cheeky script of the Santal, which was also found by a prophet magically inscribed on a rock, and various indigenous scripts among Zomian minorities across Highland Southeast Asia, all linked to stories of a lost and rediscovered ancestral heritage. For the Sora, this has a particular local twist. Turning spirits into letters of the alphabet subverts the very point of spirits, as I was taught to understand them by the shaman. The reason they now can't cause illness is they are no longer human, and they are no longer relation. This perspective also challenges my own understanding of the old religion as an aboriginal cosmology of ancestors without gods, by making the absence of gods seem like a theological failure, a falling away from a higher form. Looking back at my early notes now, I realized that they were documenting a process of reaching out to a wider world that was passing from feudalism and colonialism into nationalist modernity. Though I didn't want to understand this at the time, the Sora world I inhabited in the 1970s was already becoming obsolete. The outsiders who were previously kept at arm's length now had to be engaged in new ways, and the point was not simply to fend them off or co-opt them by marrying them in the underworld, but to find ways of joining. Each of the new movements offers its own solution to this weakness, ranging along a spectrum from rejection to reform. Baptists seek a way of being Sora with no reference to spirits at all, either as causes of events or as ancestors. This is rupturism as a core ideology and enforced instant forgetting. But of course, you have to keep reminding yourself what it is you're trying to forget. Hence the church's anxiety about backsliding as Satan keeps on tempting people with alcohol and naughty sex. These are all discourses of awakening and joining the mainstream. They reinforce the impact of schools, roads, and jobs by drawing the Sora more directly into the nation-building and political parties of the Indian state. For Christians, Animists were always ignorant. For Hindu reformists, they had become ignorant by losing contact with the gods. Compared to the ancestor-laden animist landscape, all of these universes are virtual. Biblical Israel, missionary Canada, Ayodhya of Rama, these all lie completely outside direct Sora experience. So the new Hindu and Christian forms are no more than functional equivalents. The anthropology of Christian conversion sometimes sees Christianity as an ultimate telos or destination. But the Sora example shows that when new opportunities appear, conversion is not just towards a new religious form, but away from an old one. Archaic forms of political humiliation have been intolerable for a long time, as is shown by the compensatory fantasies of the shaman spirit husbands. These entangled relations were always oppressive, and that style now appears too small for the aspirational world of literacy and government jobs that the Sora now inhabit. They are no longer victims of a one-way extractive economy, but recipients of effective government programs and participants in the nation state as voters and even political party candidates as well. It's striking how every one of these new Sora religions blocks the memory of grandparents' names. Christians give their names of characters from the Bible. Hindus give them mainstream Hindu names, and schools often impose these even on Christian children. In turning their back on the cries of the dead, young Sora are erasing their parents from their upgraded identity. Their parents' economy burning their bodies out on jagged mountainsides to raise scanty Neolithic crops. Their hardened feet cracked from clambering over abrasive rocks. And their lanky shanks exposed under tattered loincloths as they stand obsequiously seeking an audience with disdainful high caste officials. And their awe and literacy of the shaman's helper spirit, all of this can only appear pathetic to their children who write Oriya at school, wear smart clothes and sandals, and fix their eyes on government jobs. By the 1990s, a generation of young Sora regarded their own parents and grandparents with what I can only call contempt, as primitive, superstitious, and ignorant. I sometimes felt I was included in this too, as a sympathizer with the old religion. Dad, you shouldn't drink, you shouldn't keep sacrificing animals, it's not bad, it's primitive. But by the early 2000s, young Baptists were becoming curious. In particular, they started to ask me for photos of their parents. My mother died when I was a child, I don't know what she looked like. So I started printing thousands of photographs in dark rooms in Cambridge and circulating them on each trip. One of my closest friends was a Sora man, a remarkable man called Monasi. He was about 20 years older than me. As a teenager in the 1940s, he had been a pioneer of Baptist conversion. He had learned to write, he had learned Oriya, he had been sarpanch, he had founded churches. I had originally sought his help with linguistic problems, but as he listened to my tapes, he was drawn back in fascination to a world he had previously rejected. He never ceased being a devout Christian, but he also started joining me in the intense study of animist rituals, in a state of inner conflict which sometimes reduced him to tears. Monasi wanted me to create something monumental out of my decades of writing and tape recording. He felt that whatever it was that I'd been pursuing all these years was not just a way of being and doing, but something that should be packaged, ready for when future generations became interested. He called this Sora culture, using the newly known Oriya word Sanskrit, and an extraordinary blend of contradicting religious purposes. He said, truly, God sent you to preserve our ancestors. There was nothing to read in Sora except the Bible and Christian leaflets and wedding invitations. But young Sora were eager now to know about their relatives in my photos from the 1970s. We saw this as an opportunity and decided to compile a volume of photos with long explanatory texts. In order to understand the photos, young Sora would be led to read accounts of their parents' lives, descriptions of their rituals, and transcriptions of their songs and conversations. So here is Monasi showing our book. This was the first book ever written in Sora about their own people, rather than about ancient priests of another race on another continent. We distributed many copies, and ever since, groups of young people have sat on verandas throughout Sora land reading it aloud. We joked that young Baptists knew more than I did about my Jewish ancestors 5,000 years ago, whom nobody has ever met, while I knew more than they did about their own grandparents with whom I had lived. Monasy was now regretting the way of life that he had done so much to abolish, and was using my field notes to help him salvage and reconstruct their past. His deep agenda was not literal revival, but to give young Sora a sense of ethnic pride by demonstrating that the old-time Sora had not been primitive. We study the wisdom of the ancient Jews in the Bible, but here is a white man who has come all this way to study something similar and equally valuable among our own ancestors. Yes, our ancestors believed in spirits and sacrificed animals, but so did the Jews in the Old Testament. It's just that they all, Sora and Jews alike, were limited because they didn't yet know about Jesus. Here is a group of cultural activists, just last December, all Christians, harvesting material from my old fields.
Lower, I think if you click at the very bottom.
Yeah, there you are. And in particular, I will talk about the young woman in the middle and the older man on the right. It's significant that most of these are also community leaders in other more explicitly political ways, just as Monasy had. But their horizon goes beyond his position as Sarpanch. So here is Lakshmi in the middle, filing her nomination as the local Congress candidate for the elections which are going on at the moment. That seat is reserved for scheduled tribes, so it matters a great deal how she presents herself as Sora. Unfortunately, she was not selected. Sorry to say. And here is Damodoro, who has unsuccessfully contested local elections variously as a communist and an independent, reenacting his speeches for me. So.
Jumdaran, Oskachepo.
Aja. Nyen banagi meranasan anin japara jomdara nore kani buje nati binasan nyena ati aji. Nyen gam taji icem lebih nan dong nyende. Nyen bera banagi meranam bina atem nyem lenden. Di sana sorkara na mengapai lingenden ambina tele bangsa deki. Asang bina ya korson irpang lebih apa ting nyen jarang korson mengbi sering irpang lebih nyen barang tik tebingkam kami. Openg taji.
Teren togalan lebon silingan loin le atipo.
Eja, kanate nyen ano sa lingen himna lingen eja. Sorpon so tanang lai janang buti jan noin latiai. Do ML tanang lai kete jan buti jartenai. Do MP tanang lai kete jan buti jartenai. Ani ji kuti tangka ojar tak korso tiji. Bendo nyen ati ir korso.
Odo pidolanyen titam.
Baksa kitu ngerap si tamtin.
Political parties, just like religious groups, are each what the Sora call an ompu. Today's ompus show how the fundamental nature of collectivities has changed. Christian and Hindu events are organized by village churches and temples. And this rival of sects is not one of complementarity, like the exogamous lineages of Pandiri's husbands and brothers, who used shamans as mouthpieces for their values. Previously, the names of lineage ancestors were chanted in rituals, branch by branch, like a kinship diagram. With the abolition of the ancestor cult, this structure was not sustained, either structurally or performatively. And the memory of ancestors' actual names has faded astonishingly fast, and much of it would be irretrievable without my feelings. The social world of young Sora is now composed largely of ombus, religious groups, and political parties that can be chosen. Though many people are born into a religion and stay there, these groups are based not on birth, but on recruitment and retention through patronage and clientage. People switch between religions and parties, often for instrumental reasons, their loyalty not necessarily rooted in an ideological community. You must belong to ompus to live a modern life, and the more socially and economically active you are, the more ompus you belong to or switch between. Ultimately, all but the most dedicated religious members resemble potential floating voters. Retaining the loyalty of foreigners of followers is fast and furious work, because choice between alternative chains of patronage is what the election system is all about. During the momentous 1977 election, when Indira Gandhi was thrown out of office, I was present in Sora villages, but nobody I know voted, or even knew how to vote. By 2000, many younger people had already become clients of a political party. They had generally supported Congress since the 1980s, and Rajiv's charismatic helicopter appearance among the Sora in May 1991, on the morning of his evening assassination in Madras. When the Odisha Chief Minister Naveen Patnaik visited the area in 2007, many people switched to his regional Biju Janata Dal party, the BJD. This was a shift not of ideology, but of patriotism. Patnaik was re-elected in 2019 for a fifth term, astonishing fifth term, and is now standing for a sixth. He's widely supported by Christian tribals who are fearful of the expansion of the BJP into the state of Odisha. So here's another reason why Christian and Hindu sects are now more appropriate to the Sora situation than the old ancestors. Unlike the old Sora creator gods, Christian and Hindu gods remain active in the world. And while the old spirits were addressed in dialogues as equals, these gods are hierarchically superior beings, addressed through devotion and prayer. In this, they're closer to the Indian idea of the king as patron or andata, bread king, a role which is now updated in the democratically elected politician, and which my friends Lakshmi and Damodoro aspire to fill. People like the old shamans, with their elaborate impersonations of the dead and their non-participation in electoral politics, will never exist again. However, such people did exist, and they were my friends too. It's been a privilege to share in that world that has now gone, and it's also a responsibility. But of what sort? Many young and middle-aged Sora today want to know more about what they can claim as their culture, but there is a paradox. Their quest is for a religion they can no longer believe in, and a culture they no longer want to live or enact. The songs, the vocabulary, the body language, the half-nakedness, an entire habitus, which is also now both heritage and an embarrassment. We would all find some surprises if we read a visitor's notes on our grandparents' lives 50 years ago. But here there is something more. Sora activists are trying to build a modern ethnic identity as a scheduled tribe, and are unsure how to use elements that are no longer available from their own first-hand experience. Sometimes the most recognizably Sora images come from exactly those elements, which in other contexts are branded as primitive, and they have become crystallized into a parody. While the surface meanings of Sora culture are sanitized, it can be hollowed out, and its surface rendered banal, even while it takes on new meanings. So you notice those wall paintings behind Damodoro. These were once small icons dictated by spirits in dreams to give shamans a map of their descent to the unknown. This is back in the 70s, when the world was black and white. So these paintings are now the focus of a residential college of tribal painting in the state capital, where the Christianized children of real shamans are trained to produce authentic Sora paintings on cloth for sale in government handicraft shops, and to paint huge frescoes across the walls of schools throughout Odisha, and even at events in China and Africa. Similarly, with Sora dancing, which sends the dead onward into the company of their ancestors. During the annual festival of the dead, this would be done for all the people in the village who had died in the last 3 years. Here is the festival in the 1980s. The dancer in the purple shirt is our old friend, Dr. Piers. Which one do you think? Yeah, just good. Yeah, so that's yeah. Years later, after that entire village had become Christian, one young man asked me for a copy of this video, and it has now spread onto thousands of mobile phones among young people who would no longer dance in this way themselves. That's one kind of new meaning. Another is when this kind of dancing is taken as shorthand for authentic tribals, and Sora are summoned, without a funeral context, to perform at local political rallies or Republic Day parades in New Delhi. The swinging tails of the Sora loincloths are still there, but they are covered with shorts or sheaths, as they were when Monasi went to Delhi to meet Rajiv Gandhi in the 1980s. So you'll see a sort of funny little sheath around his waist. The raw material in field notes enables future interpretations which may go beyond the understandings of the moment. So one could ask Sora Christians and high caste government officers, and anyone who regards the old religion as barbarous, why did spirits exist? Why were they accepted if all they really did was to catch sacrifices and exploit their descendants? Monasi was onto something when he made subversive speeches arguing that their ancestors were not naive fools, as the church was training young people to think. But for me, he was still limited by his belief that it was only Jesus who had brought enlightenment. As we sat together for weeks transcribing ancestors' songs and correlating them with place names, it was a revelation to him to realize what our texts were saying loud and clear, that those ancestors did not simply demand sacrifices. Because they resided in specific cultivation sites, they also functioned as title deeds for their descendants and actually fed them with their own soul force through the crops grown on that site. The whole system was not a one-way extortion, but a reciprocal flow of mutual sustenance. My field notes provide the detailed evidence for any future argument that the oppressiveness of the old way of life did not lie in Sora theology, but in their political economy. That was the one-way extortion, and the spirits unfairly carried the blame. But to be usable in this way, field notes would need a lot of signposting and guidelines. Can they simply be deposited in a heap on open access? What are the dangers? Songs and dances can become generic folklore, and that's safe enough. I used to worry that the authorities might use my information against the community, for example, about landholdings. But actually, that would involve an awful lot of well-informed work, trawling through material in a language they don't understand. And such matters 50 years have been overtaken by events, as the political and economic landscape has become so utterly different. Perhaps a more significant danger is about revealing intimate family matters, about feelings, enmities, sex, sorcery, all seeds for possible future quarrels. My archives contain narratives, intonations, laughter, irony, and sobs. I will never have enough time to go through this and censor it. And even so, what would I be looking for? Dialogues with the dead were a technique for managing and pacing their forgetting. Could my notes waken sleeping ghosts? Well, recently I met Sagalo, you remember, whose baby Disamor I had helped to place in an orphanage in 1977, when his mother Pandari was killed by the spirits of her patrilineal ancestors. I had not seen Disamor since he was a baby. He was now working 500 miles away on a construction site in Hyderabad, and his father wanted me to visit him. I went there and found Disamor in a white hut with a light blue interior. It was clean and pleasant, but completely bare, and home to several young Sora Christian men who slept with their Bibles next to a heap of sand on the cement floor. Disamor had failed 10th grade, a new concept of failure derived from the new concept of schooling. But he was economically successful, had risen to overseer, and was sending money home to his father. Earlier, Sagalo had been a pauper subsisting on unirrigated millet and begging for occasional day labour on richer people's paddy fields. Now he was buying fields himself from the haughty village headman, who had a cash flow problem. Disamor knew that I had somehow been involved in rescuing. But what else did he know about that terrible day decades earlier? I had a recording in which every detail was recounted to a background of howling relatives, supposedly by his dead mother herself, as she described her sensation of being eaten alive while she struggled to save him. Did I have a duty to revive that memory? Or on the contrary, a duty not to? Would it be a precious insight into his personal history, or an archaic embarrassment, or a precipitator of emotional distress with no opportunity for resolution through dialogue with his dead mother? There was no precedent for this anywhere in Sora experience. The inhibiting presence of the other youths in the hut made the decision for me, and the moment passed. Finally, I want to talk about field diversity. Field notes can often also have a significance beyond the community altogether. We hear a lot about endangered species and endangered languages. But what about endangered religions and spirits? The thousands of religions throughout human history are mostly unwritten and undocumented. As they disappear, they leave little, if any, trace. Unlike Christianity or nationalist styles of Hinduism, smaller indigenous cosmologies occupy ecological niches, each tightly adapted to local social and historical situations. As with loss of biodiversity, the extinction of Sora animism will be one more step in an irreversible global loss of theodiversity. Theodiversity is exactly what Hindutva, as much as baptism, aims to eliminate. If indigenous religions are like endemic species, then world religions are like invasive ones. For Sora Christians today, and even for neo-Hindus with their intense focus on Rama and Krishna, the reduction of all the ancestors to one god or a few gods parallels their current reduction of the botanical diversity of shifting cultivation to cashew plantations, and echoes a worldwide shift to economies based on single commodities like plantations or mines, and the globalized banking system, a parallel in extractive capitalism between monocropping and monotheism as a non-pluralist totalizing attitude to the world. This parallel makes it more pressing than ever to explore the largely unknown diversity of human cosmological thinking. Diversity of forms is essential for flexibility and survival, and not only in biology. In the 21st century, space travel may even confront us with extraterrestrial religions, and we'll need a more broad and more pluralistic repertoire of responses than ever before. Animistic traditions like the Sora, and the diverse traditions of thousands of other communities, constitute an archive of possibilities, a spiritual and intellectual gene bank to fall back as we become limited to the world's few dominant ideologies of the moment. Most of this is physically and philosophically difficult to access. It's ignored by theologians and left to the small, theologically untrained profession of anthropology. And much of it is available only through field notes, the accumulated experience of thousands of anthropologists in tattered notebooks, scratched cassettes, and now digital files. These are often the most detailed form of documentation available to the outside world and even to future generations of the community itself. These field notes too can be in danger. Srinivas's book is a great achievement of memory and reconstruction, and despite these obstacles, it is nonetheless a milestone in our understanding of a multi-caste village in South India. If his field notes had survived in their entirety, how much more would have been available to that community and to the analysis of Indian society? Thank you.
So we've got half an hour, 20 minutes for questions, and then we will proceed to a reception. So I think I forgot, I was so worried about mentioning all the institutions that have funded this. My name is Dr Piers Vitebsky. I teach anthropology and politics at the King's India Institute, and I will be looking out for hands. Okay, great. One, and that was first.
Hi, James Page, LSE. Actually, you play quite a big role in my family. My dad enjoyed your reindeer head so much. And now when he says, you know what's interesting, my whole family goes, Siberian reindeer? But yeah, I was interested in sort of that transition from sort of across the generations and sort of wondering how that's affected kind of gender relations, but also the kind of ecological. Presumably there's kind of gender traditions and ecological traditions that continue in some form, and whether that transition or change of religion is then starting to bring then as well.
Yes, gender has changed significantly because the old tribal culture, not only among the Sora, right across the central Indian belt, was well known for the comparative freedom of women. And actually, town Hindus had all sorts of fantasies about sexual orgies and whatever. And all these new religions are very masculist. They're very constraining of women. So you really notice the difference between the generations. And the women are now all wearing saris, they're all very covered up, and they tend to cover. In church, they have to cover their heads because St. Paul told them to, and so on. So it's made a major difference. Even though they're all now educated, so of course many of these girls become school teachers. But even so, they have to behave, and especially church is a kind of zone of repression.
So no more half-naked
Absolutely.
cigar smoking.
No.
Have any of the ancestors' voices, however inconveniently, been determined to be heard?
Well, they make themselves, I mean, they create situations when you have to talk to them because they make you ill. So you go for a divination, and you know, who's making me ill? And and various people, not me, it wasn't me, but trans so-and-so. And finally, so-and-so said, yes, I'm making you ill because I'm angry with you because, or I love you so much, I want you to come and join me in the underworld. And there's some kind of reason, and then you have to defend yourself and talk it through.
But now?
Oh, now, well, that's a very interesting one because I think young people who have never known any of the old system, probably not, but the generation who transitioned in mid-career, absolutely. So very often for those people they were formed as animists and then they become Christians and have to live their lives as Christians, ancestors come to them in dreams. And very elaborate dreams, which they can recount, which are uncannily like a dialogue between two sides. So the dream actually stages the entire dialogue, which the person is no longer allowed to do out loud. But the difference is a dialogue is very public with everybody listening in and gathering around, and the dream is only inside, unless you tell it to people, which some of them do tell you.
Yes, I'm David Moss from SOAS. That was fabulous. Thank you so much. You began with MN Srinivas and his memory. Now I'm curious about your memory. I'm curious about the way in which, in the light of what you come to know, you, to what extent, or if you think you yourself redescribe what you remember, and how you revisit your own past as a field worker. and how that gets rewritten, or does it get rewritten? And what do you think about that rewriting? Because you're also in this process of remembering in the light of the trajectory and the kind of almost teleology of how things change, a kind of modern narrative of how people become modern and how the tradition becomes the tradition in the process. So can you tell us something about your remembering?
Yes. Well, firstly, I was away in Siberia for 13 years in around about the 1980s and 90s. So when I revisited, that had been a period of very great change. So I was very shocked, and I noticed the change because my mind was still so much set in the way things had been before. So that was one kind of form of remembering. But more broadly, if I revisit old notes, that I hadn't looked at for 30 years or something like that, I find all sorts of things that I had forgotten or didn't realize, and connections that I had somehow missed. But also the very act of writing things out exteriorizes it, and then it ceases to be a very strong memory for yourself. And you start just remembering and believing the written version that you have created, which is already a simplification. So when I first came out of the field for my first long fieldwork, I remember I gave, in SOAS they made us give talks immediately after fieldwork, which I wanted to, but well, actually was a very good thing they did. And I remember, I sort of remembered everything, and people were sort of astonished, how can you remember so much? Well, I just did, because it was recent and it's fresh. But those same things now come to me only through a sort of screened version, because I have rehearsed them. And the more often you tell a story or something, the more, not alienated exactly, but it becomes sort of extruded and exterior. But what is now vivid is, of course, I'm now talking to these young people. And I can't go for the same long stints of 12 months or 24 months that I used to, because I'm old, I have children and grandchildren, whatever. So it's not the same immersive experience, but there's definitely a sense of accumulation, geological layers. You can excavate and you can make connections between sort of the pre-Cambrian and the Cretaceous and the Holocene.
There's a question in the back.
Sorry, previous member of Magic Circle from Cambridge, so
What's your name?
Adil. I've been thinking about your talk in relation to both forgetting and remembering, right? And those two polar opposed human activities as we're involved in. In the university, we're in the business of remembering, it seems, less forgetting. We remember the past, we remember other places, we remember peoples, whatnot. But you pointed out in your talk a very important juncture in your talk where you highlighted a discerning, a value of a discerning of forgetfulness, Pandari's son. Now that's a moment I thought where forgetfulness becomes not just utility, it's not just utility, there's a value attached to the forgetfulness. Because Pandari needs to be forgotten a little so that her son can live on. So that led me to think about the other comment which you told us about, which was when you were told to be God sent. Now, God sent can very quickly become a part of the pantheon of gods. My argument, therefore, is that is there a discernment to be forgotten a little by the Sora as well, so that you avoid becoming a god for them?
Well, of course, I couldn't become a god for the Christians, but I might become a minor god for Hindus, I suppose, after dying. Yes. Certainly, there's the question of their memory of me, which also, of course, it fades like anything else. But people remember, old people, remember all sorts of incidents that I've forgotten. Do you remember that time we did this and you said this and I said that? And then the young people, of course, never knew me when I was young. And if they now meet me, I'm some old guy from something from the past, some town of their grandparents or whatever. So I suppose the old time has had some kind of representation of me. new people will have a different one. And they probably regard me as a very primitive kind of theologically primitive person. I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I think the old system was about forgetting in a very carefully paced way. So it was something that needed to be controlled. And all these new religions are about sort of instant, ruthless, sort of catastrophic forgetting. But in order to do so, they have to hark back to an ancient past, but it's not their own past. The Christians have a past of ancient Israel. And they were astonished to discover that Jews still exist today. They thought they were some like unicorns from some fantasy. And the Hindus, with all their Ayodhya stuff and so on, again, they're referring to a past which nobody has experienced. And by inserting the Sora into the Ramayana, also, perhaps that never happened. But they're making it happen now. So this is a kind of an anti-forgetting, but it's highly selective.
Michael?
There's something totally fascinating going on here, which is all to do with text, script, and writing things down.
Mm.
When I was amongst a similar tribal group to yours, they always said, you'll never understand us until you put your pencil and paper away, and you just live with us.
Mm.
And I was endlessly typing out index cards, this, that, and the other. That has now become enormously valuable material, which they love to have given back. And I have created a website where I'm giving it all back to them, and they've got access to all the research materials I made. But the most interesting thing that really relates across these cultural barriers is not text. It is not myth, but photographs.
Mm.
Photographs trigger thought, which is non-verbal, which is non-textual, and it's incredibly valuable to them, simply because it's not limited by, how can I put it, a vocabulary or an alphabet. And they are absolutely lapping up photographs of their grandfathers, which I took in 1973, and a good old black and white thing. And how can I put it? That is an interchange of information which is enormously successful. Whereas I have also given them back their mythologies of how the world was created. They don't give a stuff about that stuff. They're not really interested in it. But the photographs speak in an extraordinary non-verbal way to me.
So how do you account for the power of the Bible, which is all in words?
Fascinating.
So what Monacy and I were trying to do was to try to produce an anti-Bible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Jesuits in my area were syncretic. And they call God Singbonga, which is the creator God that the Ho people have in Singbonga, in what is now Jharkhand. And that syncretic form of converting to Christianity is totally different, because it allows for the worship of the dead, it allows for shamanism to exist within, so to speak, a Christian environment. That has not happened in the whole Baptist tradition.
No. Well, that is why the Catholics are making inroads now.
Yeah.
So if you are outed in church for naughty sex or drinking or whatever,
Go to the Catholic.
the Catholics say, "Come and join us." Yes, yes.
But on Michael's point, I wonder which bits of this culture that that you're giving back to them, they like. Well, okay, the dance. And what did they say about the dance? And you know what?
They have a sort of folkloristic attitude. It's sort of folklore. It's our thing, but it's not about transitioning the dead through a series of stages and so on. I mean,
But which bits of this culture that they're.
But the Baptists, well, the Baptists also use the old word for creator God, kitun, for this one. It's just that he's got a capital K instead of a small one, so to speak, and he's the one and only. And he has all sorts of adjectives like Lord God and the unique God and so on. Because it's absolutely not syncretism. This is what we're resisting all the time.
Yeah,
I think you're understanding their other culture and you're forgiving of the radical changes they've gone through, and your fascination with what has happened is very profound, Piers. And I admire, because I made a film of a certain dancing tradition called Dudurari, which they have now adapted into a very Bollywood version of it. And that Bollywood version of it, I feel, is a wrecking of it. It's a destruction of what the whole dance tradition was originally. That week-long festival, which was a Bacchanalian festival. You don't see it as a continuation of the original culture in the way that I, as an anthropologist, want to preserve the original.
Well, in the 90s, I was very much like that. But then I realized, well, I can't keep talking to these young people if I have that attitude. And I don't like the culture, but I like the people. So,
I mean, I'm terribly because my website was designed by an Adivasi who's now studying linguistics at Edinburgh University. I've always been overtaken by them.
well, that's good. That's the ideal. I think the Sora are not yet up to that, but they are. So this last time I met a young man who's doing a PhD in Delhi, a young Sora from one of these villages. And it's the first time I've ever met a Sora who spoke an excellent English. Really sophisticated English. So it's all changed.
Yeah. My name is Ralph Gillius. Yeah, fantastic. My question goes in the same direction. I worked around 20 years later in the same area where you were, but of course I emphasized on the music and dance. And in many areas in the world, I think you talked about endangered religions. Of course, religions go and the old belief systems go. We cannot change this. But of course, the music and dance will stay. And I think there's a way, there's not only the folklorization, there's also a way to put music and dance on the art stage. And I just wonder whether you observed anything like this, that people really seriously try to preserve some of the dances and some of the songs. Of course, the songs are related to the ancestors, I know that, which is different, but still, the music is there, the musical instruments are there, they're still played, at least a few years ago when I was there last.
Yeah, and the Christian, well, so each category of spirit used to have its own signature tune. So a particular pentatonic scale, arranged in this way or that way, so it was sort of like a Wagner opera, you knew which character was coming with which tune. But there was one tune that was used for totally secular things, like work songs and commenting on life kind of songs and so on. And that is the one and only tune that the Christians use. They use it non-stop all the time. So they have sort of isolated one kind of semantic field, so to speak, from all the possible drum beats and tunes. And then the dancing, even at funerals, apart from a small group of weeping people at the centre, everybody else was having a great party. They were drinking and flirting and so on. So it's still, at the tap of a drum, people will immediately move into this dance. And they're just having a good time, just not communicating with the dead. So even the Baptist Church has taken that over. But Baptist funerals are almost nothing. You just put the person in the ground and the pastor says a couple of words and then you build a sort of cement tomb on top and you walk away. But weddings are a big, big thing. Well, in the old days, weddings were not. And now they are. And they are Indian type weddings, huge and expensive. So previously it was
not white dresses.
Sometimes yellow saris, even. Sometimes white saris, but not particularly, no. But huge feasts and so on, with endless dancing. but always this secular, the tune that is not the tune of a particular spirit. And that's the dancing you would see now, that's all you would see.
Okay, we've got two more questions, one David and then one in the back. Then you can carry on talking in the over breaks.
So do we have any screening as well?
Somebody on the screen's got a hand up.
Oh, is that right? Okay, oh, Katie's one. Okay. Yes, let's see if I can work out how to.
Click on view, perhaps.
Yes, let me try this.
So let me not suggest it.
Okay. Oh, okay.
That's it, yes.
Allowed to talk. Katie, could you unmute yourself and talk to us?
Yeah, I'm here.
You need to show me.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. No, I was going to ask. First of all, I loved your lecture so much. Thank you so much for that. Am I able to turn my picture on? Maybe not.
Try it.
I see no place to turn it on.
Okay, we can listen to you.
You can just hear. Okay. So I was about to almost even send it by text and think it might be more appropriate. But I want to ask here, how might your field notes, photos, and etc. travel like Sora butterflies through the mobile phones and other devices of your research partners today? And related to that, how might your field notes be keeping the old Sora religion alive, even if only as butterfly memories, in the new cosmoecology of Sora land?
Well, the last one, I suppose, might not happen. I mean, even the butterflies, the whole point was they didn't disappear, but they ceased to be operative or relatable. And that's, in one way, any documentation of the old religion will cease to be relatable in the sense that people can't literally empathize with it or literally believe it. It's like, you know, you go to Delphi and you realize there's nobody who believes in the Greek gods anymore. And there's something missing. But migrating through mobile phones, yeah, I mean, digitization is an amazing kind of thing because it can be transmuted from one state, one carrier to another. Metempsychosis, sort of endless reincarnation can go on and WhatsApp. But of course, we know that early forms of discs and whatever are already unreadable. And only today, Michael has given me some cassettes from our trip there. What year did we go?
93.
Okay, they're already unreadable, this disc. We can't find anybody these tapes to. So maybe a sort of butterflyization happens to these things anyway. Yes.
Okay, so let's have the last two questions. Thanks, Katie. And then we proceed to drinks.
Thanks so much. Because, yeah, as everybody says, this was absolutely fascinating. So many parallels, but specifically, I was quite surprised that you occasionally hinted a little bit of a revivalist movement of the traditional religion, but it didn't really seem to lead anywhere, which I think is quite unusual. I think it's the more common pattern, if we look at other places, is that there is a consistent attempt to start rebuilding things a bit. And I was wondering whether the reason that it's not only to do with the religion which is now dominating them, but also to the pattern of education. Because you did, I think, again, you hinted that residential schools are now operating, and I was wondering whether you could expand on the relationship between education and possible traditional religious revival.
Yes, I mean, there's nothing more destructive than schools for culture.
It's all the education takes place outside the community, does it?
Well, there are some of the schools are in the village, but they're kind of authority structures and cognitive structures and so on, which owe nothing to the grannies back home. The school teachers, some of them are outside Brahmins, whatever. Some of them are Soras who have themselves been through the process. But there is no value system, I suppose, which validates those aspects of the old culture. one would have to believe literally in certain things that what nobody wants to believe in or nobody can. And also you have to have an entire community. I mean, you saw that dancing, for example. That annual festival of Dead died out when only half the village had converted, because there just wasn't enough critical mass to make it happen. It needs a complementarity of various people to then go experience.
There's no diaspora arrival in the urban areas where these people are moving to?
No, not at all. They're
Not in
absolutely
Africa.
Christian. They're absolutely Christianized. There are large communities of Sora in the tea gardens in Assam. And that is interesting. I've been there. I went there with monasy. And some were Christianized, some were still very unchristianized. And the strange thing was they were using monasy and me as native informants to tell them about the true form of their traditions. So they were already trying to get behind that kind of folklorization. But even so, I mean, if you look at that dance, you can go and do that dance for a politician. You don't need any of the old theology in order to do that. And you don't need to be the old kind of person. That's why I also try to understand what it is to be the kind of person who is formed that way, and does that way, and relates that way. So people don't relate to each other. They don't relate in that interpersonal. They now have these internal souls which have to match up to what God and Jesus want. And there's a great increase of verbs in the middle form or the reflexive form, which means you do things to yourself. You think internally yourself. You feel internally.
There's a cognitive change happening at the same time.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful.
We've got one more question.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed so much. I'm Kapil and I'm a PhD student in geography here at King's. My question goes back to what you can give back to the community, and it comes from what you were able to understand and capture in those times. The depth of relations that you could yourself understand as an anthropologist who was coming from another world. And if we understand today the ontological difference, of entering a different cosmology, could you just understand the dance, what people were doing? Or could you also relate to the spirits yourself, so you could not just see it, what was happening? So what you were recording, what it truly captures and what it doesn't capture. So what does the archive actually just pass on to?
Well, on the one hand, if I was adding any thoughts of my own as we went along, which I would do a lot in square brackets, that just represents what I was thinking or feeling at the time. But something like an actual recording of an actual dialogue is there. It has a certain kind of objective status. And people later may look at it and see something quite different in it from what I saw. And in fact, I gave the example, so to speak, that the Christians already did not think that there was a cycle of reciprocal giving between the living and the dead. But when they looked at the texts that their own parents and grandparents had sung or spoken, there it was. So that doesn't mean they had to go back to believing in those spirits, but it does mean they should stop thinking that that old religion was simply a naive and primitive religion of stupid people.
Well, an exploitative fundament.
Yes, yes. But the exploitation actually was elsewhere. It was in the political economy, not in the theology. So I think we can't predict, we can't foresee what will happen next. So, for example, this young man who has excellent English, he's now reading my books, and he'll be the first Sora who has ever read them. Let's see what he thinks.
And then next you'll be reading Freud.
Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we do need to wrap up, and all the other questions can be asked over drinks. We're going to proceed through the Somerset room, but thank you very much